With great power comes great responsibility. We've all heard this quote, and it's one of the simplest ways one can put the life of superheroes into perspective. But that begs the question, what happens when the power is in the wrong hands? To answer that, we bring forth Ultraman. Ultraman is a formidable opponent, going head-to-head in terms of power and brute force with Superman. But what else is there to know about this man? Let's find out. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you, let's begin. Who is Ultraman and what is his origin story? Ultraman, the evil counterpart, or rather, the evil version of Superman, has a very similar backstory to Superman, but not quite at the same time. We know how Superman ended up on Earth, yes? Krypton exploded and Jor-El, Superman's father, sent Superman to Earth in a life pod to protect him. Then he was adopted by loving parents who raised him to be a good person, and that gave rise to Man of Steel, who decided to use his power for better and protect everyone around him. But what if he wasn't given that love? What if he wasn't given the care and guidance he deserved? That is where Ultraman comes in. In the case of Ultraman, the world was far bleaker. Krypton of Earth 3 was about to be destroyed in the hands of the Anti-Monitor. Because of this imminent danger, Jor-El sent his son Kal-El to Earth 3. But unlike Jor-El, whose primary focus was for his son to grow up and be a good person and use his power to protect others, Jor-El indoctrinated his son into knowing that power is everything. Because of that reason, we get to see Ultraman's obsession with being powerful. Once he crash-landed on Earth, Kal-El ended up in the hands of Jonathan and Martha Clark. Unlike the Clarks of the Prime Earth, the Clarks of Earth 3 were a dysfunctional family, with whatever pieces of green kryptonite landed on Earth 3 with him. Kal-El forced the Clarks to take him in as their son. We can clearly see how different his upbringing is from his counterpart, Superman. But that's not all. Kal-El stayed with the Clarks until he was 7. And then he killed them off and burned their farm to the ground because he was done with them. By absorbing the powers of the green kryptonite, Kal-El ended up developing his powers. Once he was powerful enough, he took on the name of Ultraman. With a new alias and armed with his power, he set out on a journey to form the Crime Syndicate of America, the evil version of the Justice League. What is the physical appearance and the characteristics of Ultraman? When it comes to the physique of Ultraman, he is a dreamboat. He is over 6 foot 3 inches tall and is 235 pounds of pure muscle. His dreamy blue eyes could almost help you confuse him as our beloved Man of Steel. But don't be fooled. He is not as selfless and as heartwarming as Superman. Suppose you compare the drawing styles of Ultraman and Superman. In that case, you will see that they are very similar, making it very easy to confuse the two. But this confusion will only last until Ultraman opens his mouth. His face always emotes in two ways: disgust and scowl. Now, let's look at the physiology of this villain. He's from Earth 3, and like other Kryptonians who are from Earth 3, he doesn't get his power drained from kryptonite. It works in quite the opposite way. Another scientific characteristic of Ultraman that sets him apart from Superman is his selfishness. In every issue, you can clearly see how Ultraman's primary focus is to glorify himself and inflate his ego. This is definitely the result of the mindset he inherited from his father, or Jor-El. How does kryptonite empower him? We all know that every superhero has a source of power, so why should Ultraman be any different? Ultraman is the evil version of Superman. The source of his power is also the complete opposite of that of Superman. Unlike him, Ultraman gains his power from kryptonite. He doesn't feel drained in the presence of the green rock. No, he instead feels more charged than ever. In the earlier comics, we saw that Ultraman had a limit on how much kryptonite he could take. If he were exposed to kryptonite for an extended period of time, effectively overdosing himself, he would end up paralyzed. But when it comes to the newer comics, we get to see Ultraman acting like a kryptonite addict. One can't say they didn't see it coming, because this addiction to kryptonite also shows off how desperate Ultraman is to prove his strength, which goes hand in hand with his boisterous and chaotic personality, which we'll discuss in a bit. But this addiction also fuels him to near invulnerability. This power that Ultraman gets from kryptonite makes it easy for him to beat up some of the most vigorous and resilient opponents in Prime Earth, as well as Earth 3. How powerful is Ultraman? When you see Ultraman, you assume he's on par with Superman, which is not quite correct. Let me explain why. Now, we know that Ultraman is from Earth 3, while Superman is from the original Earth, or Earth 1. We know that he gets his power from kryptonite, while Superman always depends on yellow sunlight. But how far does his power truly run? The short answer would be very deep. In theory, if we look at Ultraman or Superman, we would see that they both have similar portfolios or powers. For example, Superman has super strength, super speed, super hearing, heat vision, X-ray vision, and more. Ultraman has the same powers, albeit with a small name change. His powers are ultra strength, ultra speed, ultra hearing, and more. However, that doesn't make him as powerful as Superman when it comes to actual practical application. When it comes to Superman, he had the opportunity to grow and expand and test out the limits of his power. Superman was never known to straight up kill his opponents. In a way, Superman grew up with his opponents, taking them on as a challenge so that every time his opponents grew stronger, he grew as well. On top of that, Superman was taught the tactical side of fighting by Batman, Wonder Woman, and the Martian Manhunter. This knowledge definitely helped him in becoming a better hero. But the same can't be said for Ultraman. Ultraman, being a part of the crime syndicate, had garnered a reputation for killing his opponents straight away. His favorite weapon was the heat vision when it came to this. But this killing of opponents took away the opportunity from Ultraman to grow as a fighter. So instead of being a skillful tactician who knows how and when to use his power, Ultraman is someone with a huge reserve of energy but no skills. He fights depending only on his brute force, which is formidable in its own way. But brute force can only take you so far. The source of power for Ultraman is Kryptonite. So, like an addict, he snorts it to become a rage and energy-filled monster. But in the first comic book portrayal, we got to see Ultraman struggle with his Kryptonite limit and end up unable to fight because of this. Hence, we can say that despite being a powerful villain, Ultraman could really use some guidance on how to be a better villain. Are there multiple versions of Ultraman? Multiverse is something that has always intrigued fans of comic books, so we all knew this was coming. Yes, there are several versions of Ultraman. If we choose not to count the multiverse ones, we would be left with a few notable versions of Ultraman. We have Ultraman, who is from Earth 3. This Ultraman was the one from pre-Crisis continuity era. He essentially chose to fly straight into the antimatter cloud and completely disappear. Ultraman was reintroduced again in the JLA Earth 2 graphic novel. This was in 1999. In this novel, the Crime Syndicate of America was introduced, and there was an antimatter version of each core Justice League member. But that's not the only version of Ultraman and the antimatter universe. We have another version of Ultraman in the same antimatter universe thanks to Jerry Ordway and Mark Waid. This version was introduced in The Brave and the Bold Volume 3, Number 11. After this, we get the post-Crisis era. In this era, we get the New 52. Here, Ultraman is introduced again, and he's from Earth 3. He gets introduced after Trinity War ends. Yet, despite all of these versions, we still see Ultraman have the same personality features, making him a fan-favorite villain. Exploring the incredible supervision powers of Ultraman. Just like Superman, Ultraman has supervision as one of his many powers. For the sake of naming, we'll call it Ultravision, but in the sense of power, it's the same thing. Usually, supervision has several types or categories. In the case of Ultraman, he's able to have 4 main types of vision, other than heat vision. Ultraman uses heat vision to get rid of most of his enemies, so we can clearly see he is biased towards it. But other than that, he uses telescopic vision to focus on distant objects without bending the law of physics. Similarly, he can also have a microscopic view, which allows him to look at the subatomic level even. On top of that, he has X-ray vision. Like Superman, his vision can penetrate everything as long as there's no lead involved. But here's where Ultraman's supervision gets interesting. He has something known as dimensional vision. Sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? Essentially, when he's high on Kryptonite, instead of hallucinating like us normies, Ultraman ends up seeing visions of what's happening in different dimensions. One could assume that perhaps this is one of the reasons why Ultraman often gets a little overboard in his Kryptonite usage. Was Ultraman once turned into a vampire? I would love to tell you that Ultraman was a straightforward villain character, but that's not the case. This man has been through hell and back. In the antimatter universe, the second Ultraman who was introduced decides to start following Mandrak. Now, who is Mandrak? Well, Mandrak is one of the eldest and oldest monitors, and we learn about him during the final crisis. Mandrak and Ultraman together decided to join hands and defeat a dark monitor. Once that was done and out of the way, Mandrak's urge to become an omnicidal supervillain came back, and he decided to turn Ultraman into a vampire. He did that because Mandrak is able to control and alter reality by controlling the energy of bleed. And by turning Ultraman into a vampire, he essentially made him his servant. And that's how Ultraman became a vampire. Is Ultraman a fool and coward? To answer this question, we would have to take a deep dive into the psyche of Ultraman. So let's strap in for a hectic ride. Firstly, we have to admit one thing. Ultraman's ego knows no bounds. He's a man who truly knows self-love, as Owlman aptly put it. But where does one draw the line between self-love and narcissism? That is what Ultraman forces us to ask. In the 4th issue of the Crime Syndicate, we get a very good view of Ultraman's Fortress of Solitude. In the Fortress of Solitude of his counterpart, Superman, we get to see our beloved Man of Steel being selfless. He celebrates his fellow Kryptonians and tries to capture the history of Krypton. But that's not the case when it comes to Ultraman. His Fortress of Solitude is filled with statues, glorifying himself and feeding his ego. Now, we know the higher you are, the more painful the fall is. This is why when you take away the source of power, you get to see Ultraman for who he truly is. In one of the issues of the New 52, you get to see Ultraman's weakness. Let's say it together, daddy issues. In this issue, we learn that his father had recorded data saying that Ultraman is worthless without his power. We assume that this is the message that his father, Jor-Il, put out to him while sending him crashing to Earth because morals take the back seat in the Krypton of Earth 3. But the message wasn't put together in the best way. It came off in a more messed up way than it already was, and because of that, he turned into this power-hungry, brute person who simply wants to be all-powerful and invincible because he thinks his self-worth is tied to that. We get to see Ultraman break down completely when Lex Luthor breaks down his source of kryptonite. Not only that, Lex Luthor forced Ultraman to be exposed to sunlight, which drained his power. The realization that he is nothing without his power affects him so much that since then, he cannot stop crying because he feels like now everyone knows how weak he truly is. For a moment, you can almost feel sympathy for this egotistical, selfish man. But that's not all. In every timeline of Ultraman, he's not happy in his romantic relationship with Superwoman. Here, Superwoman is the counterpart of Lois Lane and Wonder Woman. She is an Amazonian and supposed love interest of Ultraman, but only in the name, because in each and every timeline, she is cheating on Ultraman. In some cases, Ultraman doesn't know that she's cheating on him with their coworker Owlman, and in some cases, he is aware of it and just doesn't care. This strenuous relationship definitely affects him in ways that he's not ready to accept. In the New 52 world, not only is Superwoman cheating on him with Owlman, but she also has a baby with Alexander Luthor. This relationship definitely takes a nosedive, which plays a huge role in Ultraman's psyche, as it would anyone in this situation. How can Ultraman be weakened? Ultraman seems pretty indestructible, and you would be right to fear him. There's not much that can stop him, just like in the case of Superman. However, everyone has an Achilles heel, and for Ultraman, it's the yellow sunlight. We know that Superman gets his powers from the yellow sunlight, so it's only acceptable that yellow sunlight that giveth also taketh away. In the case of Ultraman, the yellow sunlight drains him. It drains him to the point that he can feel completely useless, and that has happened before. Not only that, another thing that can weaken his monstrous and cynical villain is a lack of kryptonite. He needs his green kryptonite to have enough energy to wreak havoc. It's almost like caffeine for him, so when he goes a long period of time without said kryptonite, it completely weakens him. This weakness is so prevalent that Lex Luthor from Prime Earth used this against him to lock him away. With just these two weaknesses and a huge myriad of powers akin to Superman, Ultraman is one of the strongest villains in the DC universe. Conclusion: no man is without flaws, and Ultraman is not any different. The key to a good villain is someone with whom we, the audience, can sympathize, and we truly did. Ultraman is almost relatable with his issues about self-worth and trying his best to hold on to one thing, power in his case, and turn it into his whole identity. Ultraman's dependency on kryptonite almost strikes a chord amongst fans because of how symbolic it can be for them. But even with all the symbolism, Ultraman is a fan favorite. Ultraman shows how power in the wrong hands can thrive and eventually destroy people by being the polar opposite of everything that Superman is and will ever be. With flaws and power, Ultraman brings a new set of challenges for our beloved Justice League to overcome. And I, for one, cannot wait to see where this takes us. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone!